In a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled in the shadows of trees and hidden behind picket fences, secrets flourished in the spaces between words, between looks, and between expectations. No one ever suspected that the seemingly perfect lives lived behind closed doors harbored hidden desires. And no one would have imagined that these desires would eventually spiral into a chain of events that would end in tragedy. But there was more to this story than met the eye. Samantha had always been the epitome of what many considered the Samantha was the picture of a perfect wife. She was elegant, composed, and always the hostess with the most S. She radiated warmth and charm that left her the envy of most women in her circle. She had a successful husband, David, who adored her. To everyone around her, Samantha lived a life most people only dreamed of. But beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic existence, something else festered. Even Samantha herself hadn't fully understood it until it was too late. Her best friend, Emily Carter, had been by her side for as long as Samantha could remember. They shared countless memories and confided in each other more deeply than anyone else in their lives. Emily was bold where Samantha was reserved. She was adventurous where Samantha was cautious. She had always been a constant figure through the ups and downs of life. Their friendship had been the one thing that remained solid and unshakable, even when other parts of their lives felt uncertain. But it hadn't always been that way. Their bond had shifted over the years. They had grown up together, shared so many memories, and confided in each other more deeply than anyone else in their lives. Emily was bold, while Samantha was more reserved. She was adventurous, while Samantha was cautious. She had always been there, a constant figure through the ups and downs of life. Their friendship had been the one thing that remained solid and unshakable, even when other parts of their lives felt uncertain. But it hadn't always been that way. Their bond had shifted over the years, gradually morphing into something. It was so lovely that they could share so many memories and confide in each other so deeply. Emily was bold, while Samantha was more reserved. Emily was adventurous, while Samantha was cautious. Their friendship had been the one thing that remained solid and unshakable, even when other parts of their lives felt uncertain. But it hadn't always been that way. Their bond had shifted over the years, gradually morphing into something else. It was so subtle at first. There were small, almost imperceptible touches, lingering gazes, and moments when the world seemed to fall away when they were together. It wasn't something either of them had planned, but it had become something neither could ignore. Samantha would catch herself thinking about Emily in ways she never had before. She would wonder what it would be like to be closer to her and cross the invisible line. That had always been a barrier between them. The thrill of those thoughts excited and terrified her. She knew she was playing with fire, but there was something so intoxicating about the idea of giving in to that forbidden desire. Something so luring about the possibility of stepping outside the confines of the life she had built. Emily, she wasn't oblivious to it. In fact, she had felt the shift long before Samantha had. She could sense the change in the air between them. The way Samantha's eyes would, Emily didn't mind how her breath would catch when their hands brushed. She welcomed it, though she was careful not to push too far and scare Samantha away. She knew that Samantha would come to her when she was ready, so she waited with patience that masked her own desire. She knew that when the moment came, it would be worth the wait. Their lives carried on as normal, outwardly unchanged. David continued working long hours at his corporate job, blissfully unaware of the simmering tension. Samantha was a devoted wife, playing the role of the perfect wife to her husband. She hosted dinner parties, attended school functions, and presented the perfect image to the world. But inside, she was torn, struggling to reconcile the life she had built with the desires that threatened to tear it all apart. It wasn't until one quiet afternoon that everything began to unravel. It was a Saturday, and the kids were away at a friend's house. On this particular weekend, David was at work, and the house was unusually quiet. Emily had come over as she often did to keep Samantha company. The two of them had settled into the living room with glasses of wine, chatting casually about nothing in particular. The conversation flowed easily as it always did between them. However, today there was something different in the air. There was a feeling of attention, an unspoken but palpable sense of something hanging between them. It was like an invisible thread waiting to be pulled. Samantha could feel her heart racing and her palms sweating. As she tried to keep the conversation light, she tried to ignore the voice in her head that was screaming at her to do something about the feeling she had been suppressing for so long. But it was Emily who finally broke the silence. "You've been distant lately," she said softly, her voice laced with curiosity. "Is everything okay?" Samantha hesitated, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. She could lie and brush it off as nothing, or she could finally be honest and admit to the thing that had been on her mind for months. Samantha finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I'm losing control of something." Emily's gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Samantha took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she sat down, her wine glass in her other hand. "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like there's something between us, something I don't understand, but I can." There was a moment when I thought, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I just said that." My heart was racing, and I was afraid that Emily would laugh or worse, recoil in disgust. But then, Emily leaned closer, her voice low and calm. "You're not imagining it," she said quietly. I felt it too. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, her mind spinning as she tried to process what Emily had said. Just then, before she could respond, Emily reached out and gently took her hand. Her touch sent a shock of electricity through Samantha's body. "I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for," Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you want this, I'm here." Samantha's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, excitement, guilt, and desire, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. She knew what she wanted and knew that she was standing on the edge of something that could change everything, but there was no turning back now. The line had already been crossed the moment she let herself imagine this possibility, and there was no pretending otherwise. Without another word, Samantha leaned forward, her lips brushing against Emily's in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was soft at first, almost uncertain, but as the seconds passed, the kiss deepened. The tension that had been building between them for months finally found release. It was as if the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of them. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not their husbands, not their families, not the lives they had built. All that existed was the undeniable connection between them, the magnetic pole that had brought them together despite everything. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, this was only the beginning. Days passed after that first kiss, and everything changed. Things changed between Samantha and Emily. They still carried on as best friends, at least on the surface. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, something deeper had ignited. It was a flame they couldn't snuff out. It was a secret that grew stronger and more dangerous the longer it simmered. Every time they saw each other, the electricity between them crackled just a little louder. Every accidental touch, every fleeting glance, every shared moment carried with it a heavy, undeniable weight for Samantha. The affair was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. She had never imagined herself capable of something like this. She had never imagined herself betraying David her entire life. But the desire, the pull toward Emily, was too strong to resist. Strong to resist, Emily was everything Samantha had craved in silence for years. Now that she had tasted that forbidden fruit, there was no turning back. Samantha's mind was constantly racing, filled with thoughts of their next encounter, their next secret rendezvous. Emily, ever the bold one, seemed to revel in the thrill of it all. For her, it wasn't just about the connection she shared with Samantha. It was about the power she felt knowing that they were breaking the rules together. Emily wasn't afraid. She was just embracing the affair with an intensity that left Samantha breathless. Even as it left her teetering on the edge of her own sanity. They became experts at hiding their relationship. They met when they knew no one would be around, slipping into each other's arms behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Each meeting was more intense than the last, their passion growing stronger as the danger of being caught loomed ever closer. It wasn't just physical anymore. There was something deeper, something that tied them together in ways that neither of them could fully understand. Samantha, once so composed and restrained, felt herself losing control more and more with each passing day. Their stolen moments felt like they existed outside of time, away from the prying eyes of the world. But life, as it always does, had a way of pulling them back to reality. Samantha still had her husband, her responsibilities, and Emily had her own life to manage. But no matter how hard things got, they always found their way back to each other. There was something deeper, something that tied them together in ways that neither of them could fully understand. Samantha, who once was so composed and restrained, felt herself losing control more and more with each passing day. Their stolen moments felt like they existed outside of time, away from the prying eyes of the world. But life, as it always does, had a way of pulling them back to reality. Samantha still had her husband and her responsibilities, and Emily had her own life to manage. No matter how hard they tried to keep up, David noticed it first. He wasn't the most perceptive man, and he wasn't the type to suspect anything bad from his wife. But even he couldn't ignore the subtle changes in Samantha's behavior. She was more distant, more preoccupied, and sometimes she would disappear for hours at a time without any explanation. When David asked where she had been, her answers were vague and almost dismissive. He didn't push it first, but the doubt had been planted, and one evening, after a particularly intense afternoon with Emily, Samantha came home to find David waiting for her in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, his hands clasped together, staring down at the floor. The tension in the air was palpable, and Samantha's heart began to race as she walked in. "Where were you?" David asked, his voice flat and emotionless. Samantha froze, her mind racing as she searched for an excuse. She hadn't expected him to be home this early. She wasn't ready to tell him why she was gone. So she just said, "I was out." She tried to keep her voice steady, but her palms were sweating. She was trying to keep her mind off of it. She was just running errands. David's eyes met hers, and for the first time in their marriage, Samantha saw doubt there. He wasn't accusing her, but there was something behind his gaze that sent a chill down her spine. "You've been out a lot lately," he said slowly. "Is everything okay?" Samantha's heart was beating fast in her chest. This was the moment she had been dreading for so long. It was the moment where everything could unravel. But she couldn't let it happen, not yet, not like this. "I'm fine," she said, her voice sounding a little hollow even to her own ears. It was only a matter of time before he started digging deeper and asking more questions. And when that happened, everything would come crashing down. But the story doesn't end here. Despite the growing tension at home, Samantha just couldn't stay away from Emily. In fact, the fear of being caught only heightened the thrill of their affair. They became even more reckless, meeting in places where they could easily be discovered. They were texting late into the night when David was only a room away. The guilt was suffocating, but the desire was strong. Samantha was pulled back into Emily's arms time and time again. Emily seemed to thrive in the chaos. She was always the one who pushed Samantha further and suggested riskier and riskier encounters. There was something dangerous in Emily, something wild that both terrified and exhilarated Samantha. But she was too far gone to see the warning signs. She was too caught up in the whirlwind of their affair to realize how close they were to the edge. One day, while the two were meeting in a secluded cabin outside town, something happened that changed everything. Cabin outside town. Samantha voiced her concerns. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The guilt was starting to eat away at her, and the fear of being found out was becoming too much to bear. "We can't keep doing this," Samantha said, her voice trembling as she pulled away from Emily's embrace. "Oh, Sam, we're so careful, really. We've always been careful, but David is starting to notice. He's asking questions, and I don't know how much longer I can keep lying to him." Emily's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough for Samantha to see the flash of irritation in her eyes. "So, what are you saying? You want to end this?" Samantha didn't answer right away. She couldn't bring herself to say the words, even though she knew they were true. "Oh, I do love Emily, at least I think I do. But, the weight of our affair is starting to crush me a little." she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just don't know how much longer I can do this. Emily's expression hardened, and she pulled away from Samantha, standing up and crossing the room. There was something dangerous in the way she moved, something cold and calculating that sent a shiver down Samantha's spine. We're not ending this, Emily said. You're mine, Samantha. You don't get to just walk away. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she stared at Emily. Her mind was reeling. She had never seen this side of her friend before. This dark, possessive side that frightened her more than she cared to admit. I'm not saying I want to end it, Samantha said, trying to keep her voice calm. I'm just saying we need to be more careful. The affair had spiraled into something dark, something dangerous. Samantha knew she was in over her head. She had played with fire, and now she was about to get burned. The tension between them only grew in the days that followed. Samantha tried to distance herself to put some space between her and Emily. David, oblivious to the true nature of Samantha's distress, tried to comfort her. But nothing he said or did could ease the fear that gripped her heart. She was trapped, caught between the life she had built with her family and the love she felt for Emily. Then one fateful evening, everything came to a head. Samantha was home alone. The kids were staying with David's parents for the weekend, and David had gone out for drinks with some colleagues. Samantha was sitting in the living room, trying to calm herself down. Her mind was swirling with the events of the past few weeks. She couldn't focus or breathe properly. The walls seemed to be closing in on her. The weight of her affair with Emily was pressing down on her chest with every creak of the house. Her heart was racing. Every gust of wind outside felt like a reminder that her life was teetering on the edge of collapse. The wine she sipped did little to calm her nerves. She was feeling a little anxious, and it was hard to shake off that dull throb. Her phone buzzed, and for a moment she thought it was David checking in like he always did. But when she picked it up, the name on the screen wasn't her husband. It was Emily. Are you alone? The message read. Samantha hesitated, her fingers trembling as she typed out a response. David's out. I need some space. A few moments passed, and then another message appeared. I'm outside. Samantha's heart dropped into her stomach. She stood up from the couch and peered out the window through the thin curtain. Sure enough, Emily's car was parked down the street, barely visible in the dim light of the quiet suburban neighborhood. Panic surged through her veins. Emily wasn't supposed to be there. They'd been careful for so long, hiding their relationship in the shadows. After so long hiding their relationship in the shadows, it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. Go home, Emily. She quickly typed. Please not tonight. There was no reply this time, but a soft knock at the front door followed seconds later, confirming Samantha's worst fear. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. She couldn't let Emily in, not now. She couldn't afford for things to escalate any further. Another knock, this one louder and more insistent. Samantha took a deep breath and walked slowly to the door. She opened it just a crack to see Emily standing there. Emily's face was partially obscured by shadows, but Samantha could see her eyes, which were pleading. Emily looked tense, but composed. Samantha, Emily said softly, you shouldn't be here, right? The affair had become a bit intense and a tad risky. David had started to notice little changes in her behavior, and he wasn't the type to let things slide. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the pull toward Emily. I know, Samantha whispered, stepping back to let Emily into the house. I just need time to figure this out. Things are getting a bit complicated. Emily entered, closing the door behind her. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at Samantha with a mixture of empathy and something harder. Samantha, I don't want to press you, but you can't keep living this double life. It's not fair to you or to David. Samantha looked down her throat tight. She knew Emily was right. The weight of the secret was suffocating her. But the idea of ending things and losing Emily was unbearable. She had never imagined her life taking this turn. She never thought she would fall for her best friend in a way that felt so right and so wrong at the same time. I need to stop, Samantha said quietly, her voice breaking. I can't keep doing this to him. Emily's face softened as she reached out and gently took Samantha's hand. I understand, Sam, but what about us? I don't want to lose you. Samantha's eyes showed the conflict she was feeling, and Emily knew that pushing her further wouldn't help. She took a deep breath and gently let go of Samantha's hand. I'll give you space, sweetheart, she said softly. But remember, you deserve to be happy too. Samantha nodded, her heart heavy. Emily turned to leave, and the sound of keys jingling in the door echoed through the house. Samantha froze. David was home. Panic surged through her as the door opened and David walked in. His expression was tired but warm, as though he was relieved to finally be home. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Emily standing there, and confusion flickered across his face. Emily, David asked, glancing between the two women. What are you doing here? Emily smiled. I was just dropping off something for Sam. I didn't realize you'd be back so soon. David raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it further. Well, good to see you, he said, though his voice was laced with mild suspicion. Samantha was still a bit shaken up, but she forced a smile. Yeah, Emily was just leaving. Emily nodded and moved toward the door, her hand brushing lightly against Samantha's arm as she passed. Take care, Sam, she whispered before stepping outside. The door closed behind her, and the air in the room seemed to shift, the tension thick enough to cut through. David set his keys down on the counter and walked over to Samantha. His brow furrowed. You seem a bit off, he said, his tone concerned but measured. Is everything okay? Samantha's heart was beating a little faster, and for a moment she thought about telling him everything about the affair, about Emily, about how lost she felt. But she couldn't bring herself to destroy everything they had built together. She just couldn't do it. It's been a long day, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. David nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. If something was wrong, you'd tell me, right? He asked gently. Samantha swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded, of course, but David wasn't done. He walked toward her and gently placed his hands on her shoulders, searching her eyes for something, an answer, a sign, anything that would explain the unease he felt radiating from her. Before he could say anything more, the phone rang, startling both of them. David glanced at the clock, confused by the late hour. He picked up the receiver and listened, his face quickly shifting from concern to something darker, anger, disbelief. Samantha couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but she could tell something was wrong. On the other end, but she could tell something was wrong. David's expression hardened, and his grip tightened on the phone. Who told you this? David finally asked, his voice low but laced with fury. There was a brief pause before he hung up the phone and turned to face Samantha. What's going on? Samantha asked, her voice shaky. David's face was flushed with anger. There's a rumor going around about you and Emily, he said. Samantha's heart sank. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. This was it. The secret was out. Is it true? David's voice wavered, a mixture of anger and hurt as he waited for her response. Samantha opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between them was deafening. David's hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightening, he whispered, You lied to me. His voice thick with betrayal. I didn't, Samantha began, but David cut her off. Samantha took a few steps back, as if the very sight of her was too much to bear. You lied to me, Sam. All this time, I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. David stormed past her, grabbing his coat and keys. I need to get out of here, he muttered, heading for the door. Samantha stood frozen, tears spilling down her cheeks as she watched him leave. The front door slammed shut, and the house fell into an eerie silence. Later that night, Samantha sat alone in the dark, staring blankly at the wall. A knock came at the door, and her heart leaped into her throat. Oh no, not again. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Emily stood on the porch, her expression calm but serious. Can I come in? Samantha hesitated, but she stepped aside, letting her in. David knows, she said quietly. Her voice was hollow, and Emily's face remained unrevealed as she sat down across from Samantha. What are you going to do? I don't know, Samantha admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He left. I don't know if he's coming back. Emily looked down, her hands resting on the table. I'm sorry, Sam. I didn't mean for things to get this far. Samantha shook her head, wiping the tears from her eyes. It's not your fault. It was bound to happen eventually. The door swung open with a loud bang, and David stormed in, his face dark with fury. David stormed into the living room, his eyes blazing as he saw Emily sitting there. "What on earth are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Emily stood up, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "David, I didn't mean for this to happen. Please, let's talk about it," she said, but David wasn't listening. His eyes were wild with a mixture of anger and betrayal, and his fists were clenched tightly at his sides as he took a step forward. Toward Emily, the room felt charged with tension, like a storm about to break. Samantha could feel the air crackling around them. "David," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think we're just going to sit down and talk about this? You've ruined my family. You've destroyed everything." Now that it was happening, she couldn't move or breathe. Emily took a cautious step toward David. Her voice was calm, but firm. "David, I know you're angry, but you need to calm down. We can't solve anything like this if you're like this." David's gaze flicked toward her, and for a moment it looked like he might explode. His whole body trembled with barely contained rage, and his eyes darted back and forth between Emily and Samantha. "Calm down," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm trying to calm down, but it's hard when you've been keeping things from me for so long. Samantha, please step between us. David, I never wanted this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you, but you're upset, and I understand. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. But David, you're shaking. You did this. You came into my home and took her from me." Emily didn't flinch, but her eyes darkened. "David, stop. You're upset, and I understand that, but this is between Samantha and me." Emily's collar, his knuckles white as he leaned in, his face inches from hers. Emily struggled against him, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to free herself. "You think you could just walk in here and take what's mine?" David hissed through gritted teeth. "David, let her go," Samantha cried, her hands pulling at his arms, trying desperately to stop him before things got worse. And then, in the heat of the moment, as they struggled and pushed, David's hand slipped, and Emily's head slammed into the corner of the wall with a loud, painful thud. Her body went limp in David's hands, and he stumbled back, his face filled with shock. Samantha screamed, and Emily crumpled to the floor, unmoving. Blood was pooling around her head from where she had hit the wall. "Oh no," David whispered, his voice trembling as he stared down at Emily's lifeless body. No, I didn't mean to." Samantha dropped to her knees beside Emily, her hands shaking as she touched her friend's face, trying to find some sign of life, some hope that this wasn't real. But there was nothing. Emily was gone. David collapsed against the wall, his face pale as the reality of what he had done washed over him. His hands were shaking, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "I didn't mean to," he whispered again, his voice hollow. "It was an accident." Samantha couldn't speak. Her whole body shook with sobs as she knelt beside Emily, her mind racing in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to end like this. David stood, his legs unsteady as he backed away from the scene in horror. "We have to do something. We have to call someone." Samantha looked up at him, her face pale and tear-streaked. "We can't call anyone." David's eyes widened in panic. "What do you mean we can't?" "She's..." "Oh no, Sam, we really need to get help." Samantha stood wiping her face with trembling hands. "If we call the police, they'll arrest you. They won't believe it was an accident." David's face was crumpled, and he buried his face in his hands. "Oh dear, what have I done?" Samantha said, her voice shaking. "We have to figure out what to do, but there's no way to make this right. Emily is dead, and their lives as they knew them are over." The house is eerily silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Samantha stood frozen, staring down at Emily's lifeless body as her mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. The affair, the lies, they were already, oh my, this was all just too much. This was something she couldn't undo. David was pacing back and forth, his hands trembling as he muttered under his breath. "What do we do, Sam? What do we do now?" Samantha couldn't find the words. Everything felt so surreal, as if she was living someone else's nightmare. She had loved Emily, hadn't she? And now Emily was gone, just like that, with one wrong move. It felt as though the ground beneath her had crumbled, leaving her standing on the edge. David stopped suddenly, his eyes wide with panic. "We have to call the police," he said, his voice trembling. "We can't just leave her here." Samantha nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered. "But if we call the police, they'll never believe it was an accident. You'll go to prison." David looked at her, his face pale. "We can't cover this up," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't just some secret affair. We can't just make this disappear." Samantha nodded, her mind racing. "I know," she said, "but we need to think." Samantha's mind was racing. She knew that they couldn't hide this. They couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. But calling the police would mean admitting to everything. Not just the murder, but the affair. It would destroy their lives in every possible way. "We need to think," she said quietly. Her voice was shaking. "We need to figure this out." But even as she said the words, she knew there was no figuring this out. Emily was dead, and no amount of planning or scheming would change that. But there was no use in scheming. The affair had spiraled out of control, and now they were left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by their own actions. David dropped into a chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt her." Samantha knelt beside Emily's body. Her hand was trembling as she reached out to close her friend's eyes. A sob escaped her throat, and she quickly wiped her tears away. "This was her. It's also our fault. We let things get out of control. We let our feelings for Emily cloud our judgment, and now Emily is gone. We need to call someone," Samantha said quietly, her voice barely audible. "We can't leave her here like this." Samantha wasn't sure anyone would believe them. They had lied too much already about the affair, about where they had been, about their lives. But there was no other choice. The truth, at least their version of it, would have to come out. The police arrived an hour later, their lights flashing outside the quiet suburban house. Samantha stood by the front door, her hands trembling as David answered their questions. He told them everything about how Emily had come over, how they had argued, and how she had accidentally hit. He left out the part about the affair, hoping that somehow the police wouldn't dig too deeply into their personal lives. But the investigation wasn't as simple as they had hoped. The officers asked questions about Emily's relationship with the Winters, about why she had been at their house so late, and about the tension they sensed between David and Samantha. And then, inevitably, they began to uncover the affair. It didn't take long for the rumors to resurface. Rumors about Samantha and Emily's relationship started weeks ago, and they spread like wildfire. Neighbors, friends, and even casual acquaintances began sharing what they had seen, like stolen glances and mysterious absences. The truth slowly began to unravel, and with it, Samantha and David's carefully constructed story. As the truth came out, David's anger grew. He was so upset that he yelled at Samantha one evening after another long round of questioning from the police. "If you had just told me the truth, maybe we could have fixed things before it got this far," he said. "We could have fixed things before it got this far?" Samantha didn't have the energy to fight back. She had spent every moment since Emily's death consumed by guilt, and David's accusations were just another layer of the crushing weight that had settled on her chest. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hollow. The trial was swift. David was charged with manslaughter, his actions deemed reckless though not premeditated. The court ruled that while he hadn't, David was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was found guilty of recklessness, though not premeditation. His actions had directly led to Emily's death. Samantha, though not charged with any crime, was left to pick up the pieces of the life she had destroyed. The community turned against her. They started whispering about her affair with Emily. They turned her into a pariah. She couldn't walk down the street without feeling the weight of judgmental eyes on her. She couldn't face the pitying looks from people who once called her a friend, and as for Emily, she was gone. Her life taken too soon in a senseless, tragic moment of anger and fear. Samantha would never forget the look in her friend's eyes that night. The shock and pain as it all fell apart. The affair, the secrets, the lies. It had all led to Emily's death. And though the world had moved on, Samantha never could. Every day, she woke up with the image of Emily's lifeless body burned into her mind. A reminder of the love she had once had and the terrible price she had paid for it. Love she had once had and the terrible price she had paid for it. There were no more secrets, no more hidden desires, no more stolen moments. All that was left was the quiet, aching truth that she had lost everything that mattered, and there was no going back. So, Samantha went on, living out her days in the shadow of her past, forever tied to the moment when her affair with Emily came to a tragic, violent end. The story ends, but the consequences of those fateful choices would linger forever.